I watched her, standing there with a rifle aimed straight at my prize bull. She called it property damage. But she forgot one small detail. You can't just shoot someone's livestock without facing the consequences. This is how a Karen made the worst decision of her life, by messing with my bull. Freeze frame. Yep, that's me. The guy whose private well HOA Karen secretly hooked into so she could water her garden without paying. What did I do? I flushed her irrigation system with sewage. And trust me, that was only the beginning. Viewer starts thinking, wait, seriously? How do you even pull that off legally? And how did she not catch on? Let me rewind a bit. I own a farm. Not some giant ranch, but enough acreage to enjoy some space, raise animals, and live life my way. I'm not the city slicker type. I prefer grease on my hands, working on my tractor, and watching my champion bull, Maximus, enjoy the fields. Peaceful, simple, and totally free from HOA drama. Until she showed up. Debbie, also known as HOA Karen, blew into my life like a hurricane. Suddenly, Maximus was a hazard, and my yard was a threat to property values. Apparently, a 1,500-pound bull was just too wild for her white picket fence fantasy. This wasn't your average HOA rep. Debbie wanted control, like total Stepford-level control. Her dream was to turn the neighborhood into something off a lifestyle blog. And bulls? Yeah, they didn't fit her carefully curated aesthetic. My first run-in with her was over my mailbox. Not broken, not offensive, just the wrong size and angle, according to her. Then it was the fence. Then the vegetable garden. Apparently, growing my own food was a crime if she hadn't approved the soil. But here's the thing, I don't cave easily. Sure, I ignored her passive-aggressive notes at first. But once she started slapping fines on my door, I got creative. I don't argue, I act. And I made sure my actions were perfectly legal. That's when I decided to give her a little lesson in property rights. It didn't take long for her to realize that poking the farmer wasn't a harmless game. Here's where it got interesting. Debbie's house sat near the edge of the neighborhood, right up against my land. Her flowers started blooming a little too bright, too fast. So I did some digging. And sure enough, she had connected her garden hoses to my private well. No notice, no permission, just decided my water was hers. Bad call. I don't take kindly to theft. I could have reported her. Instead, I got creative. I understood exactly how her water setup worked. I also knew how to flush it. Not just cut it off, flush it. With sewage. I made sure the timing was perfect. No real damage, just enough for her garden to rot like compost on a bad day. The best part? She never figured out who did it. She just assumed some bitter neighbor was sabotaging her. Meanwhile, I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, as her prized tulips turned into a biohazard zone. But Debbie wasn't done. That's when she made her biggest mistake, going after Maximus. Now let's talk about this bull. Maximus wasn't just livestock. He was a blue ribbon, show-stopping legend. Big, bold, and incredibly well-trained. He wasn't some stray animal you could scare off. He was my pride, my legacy. I poured time, money, and love into raising him. To me, he was family. But to Debbie, he was just another eyesore. Something she couldn't control. Something that didn't fit her vision of perfection. And in her mind, that made him a target. One afternoon, a neighbor called to tell me Debbie was out in her yard, screaming that Maximus had eaten her flowers. Now, I'd seen Maximus wander near her yard before, but he wasn't the kind to tear up someone's garden. Debbie, of course, saw it differently. She'd been complaining about the bull for months, and in her mind, this was the final straw. She marched over to my property, dragging along her angry little group of HOA board members, and that's when the whole thing went from silly to downright absurd. She stood in the street, yelling at me to get Maximus off what she claimed was shared land. Somehow, in her mind, part of her personal empire. I asked if she'd ever heard of property laws, but that was too much for her to process. She wanted to make a scene, so she walked up to Maximus and pulled out a rifle. Yep, a rifle. Before I could react, she was aiming it right at him. Property damage, she screamed, like the bull had any clue what that even meant. I'm not big on drama, but nobody threatens my animals, not over some ridiculous HOA grudge. My heart was pounding, but I stayed steady. Maximus was just standing there chewing grass, totally unaware of the chaos building around him. But I knew this was it. I couldn't let her pull this stunt. I needed to stop her from doing something insane, but I also saw my moment. You can't just shoot livestock and walk away from it. Oh, Debbie, You're about to find that out the hard way. Stay tuned. As I watched her point that rifle at Maximus, time seemed to slow. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't panicking. This was the natural next step in the ridiculous battle we'd been fighting. But this was something else entirely. I could see the whites of her eyes as she tried to steady the gun. The whole thing would have been funny if it wasn't so dangerous. Here she was, a grown woman, about to shoot my prize bull over a few blades of grass, acting like it was a personal war. Now, I don't claim to be the world's best rancher or some expert on handling disputes, but one thing I do know, you don't shoot an animal unless you've got a damn good reason. Maximus wasn't some wild creature on the loose. He wasn't charging or threatening anyone. He was just doing what bulls do, minding his own business. But to Debbie, he represented everything she hated about my farm, everything she couldn't control in her perfect little HOA fantasy. Get your damn bull off my property, she yelled, finger twitching on the trigger. She was shaking all over, clearly worked up, but I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of seeing me react. I stood there, hands up, trying to keep it from blowing up further. I had to get through to her before she made an irreversible mistake. Debbie, I said calmly, trying to cut through the noise. You sure you want to go through with this? I nodded toward Maximus, who was still just standing there looking confused. He's not your enemy. He's just enjoying his day. Property damage, she shrieked again. He's destroying my yard. You think I'm letting that happen? I took a breath, trying to hold it together. The air felt heavy with tension. But this wasn't about Maximus. It never was. This was about Debbie's obsession with control. I wasn't giving in to her power trip anymore. Maximus, sensing the energy shift, stepped back a bit. He wasn't the kind to start trouble, but he didn't like having a weapon pointed at him either. I could see him getting uneasy, shifting his weight like he was ready to bolt. That was the last thing I needed, a nervous animal and a woman with a loaded rifle. Put it down, Debbie, I said, voice firmer now. You don't want to do this. There are actual laws here. She scoffed, clearly not interested in legal talk. Laws. Please. I'm protecting my land, she snapped, narrowing her eyes the way people do when they think they're above consequences. He's costing me money, ruining what I've built. I couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. She was standing in front of me, daylight blazing down, threatening my bull over a yard she didn't even fully own, and acting like the hero. It took everything I had not to laugh. But this wasn't the time to joke. It was time to act. I thought about rushing her, taking the rifle before things got worse, but that would have made it a whole lot messier. One wrong move, and we'd be in real danger. I needed a smarter play. Then it hit me. I wasn't just some guy she could boss around. I had the law behind me. And Debbie, in all her confidence, had forgotten one key detail. You can't just shoot someone's livestock couldn't be harmed without cause, not without serious legal consequences. And I was about to make sure she learned that the hard way. Debbie, you're making a huge mistake, I said, stepping in closer. If you shoot that bull, you're getting into more trouble than you can handle. You might think you're in the right, but I know enough to make sure you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Her grip on the rifle tightened. Don't tell me what I can and can't do. This is my land, and I'll defend it however I want. I could feel the rage rising in me. I'd tolerated enough of her drama to last me forever, but now she was pointing a gun at Maximus, the one thing on this land I truly loved. I wasn't about to let that slide. Listen, Debbie, I said, stepping in even more. I've been more than patient. I let your absurd complaints slide. I let you waste HOA meetings on nonsense. But if you think you can come onto my land, point a rifle at my bull, and walk away without facing the fallout, you've got another thing coming. I'll make sure you regret this. She hesitated. For a second, I thought maybe I'd broken through. But then the wild look came back in her eyes. She was too far gone, convinced she was the hero of some twisted story. I saw her body tense up, finger tightening on the trigger. Just as I started to step forward again, a voice cut through the air. Debbie, stop. I spun around to see my neighbor Carl jogging toward us. I hadn't even noticed him watching from his porch. Carl was a quiet guy, retired cop, and one of the few people who'd been kind since I moved in. He saw the situation for what it was and wasn't going to let it spiral. Carl stepped between us, hands raised in that calm way cops do. Put the rifle down, Debbie, he said, steady and firm. You're not in the right. Debbie glared at him, her face flushed red with frustration. This doesn't concern you, Carl, she snapped, but he didn't flinch. I think it does, he said. You can't shoot someone's animal without serious consequences. You're seconds away from a huge mistake. Put the gun down. The tension was so thick, it felt like it could snap. Debbie stood there, frozen, the rifle still locked on Maximus, fury rolling off her. But then, slowly, she lowered the weapon. Her eyes burned with defeat, but she backed away. Still, I felt a chill run through me. This wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Debbie had crossed a line, and I knew she wouldn't back down for good. She'd come at me again. But this time, I'd be ready. As she walked off, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Maximus stayed calm, chewing grass like nothing had happened. But I knew this was just the beginning. I wasn't the only one with tricks up my sleeve, and now, the game had begun. My first move was already in play. It didn't take long for the story of the rifle incident to spread around. In a close-knit neighborhood, word moves fast. Within hours, everyone knew Debbie had pulled a gun on me, and more importantly, on Maximus. Carl was a huge help. He told everyone who would listen, even called the local sheriff himself. He wasn't going to let her skate, and neither was I. But I also knew this wasn't over. Debbie wouldn't just walk away. And I'm not the kind of guy who backs down. So I got to work. I wasn't about to let Debbie keep running her one-woman terror campaign. I'd been preparing for months. Every one of her ridiculous complaints, I'd save them. Every call, every bitter letter, I kept it all. But my best weapon? Knowing the law. This wasn't just about protecting Maximus or my land. It was about making a statement. Debbie crossed a line, and now, she'd learn what real consequences felt like. I started with a basic approach: expose her hypocrisy. I wasn't going to sit by and let her tantrums continue. I needed to make the whole neighborhood see her for what she really was. So I started collecting evidence. Photos, recordings, anything I could get to show how unhinged she'd become. I knew most people were scared to speak out, but once they saw the truth, they'd have no choice. One of my first moves was reaching out to neighbors who'd been victims of her petty campaigns. And there were plenty. People fined for minor things, told they couldn't park their RVs in their own driveways, or that their bird baths weren't aesthetic enough. They'd been annoyed for ages, but afraid to fight back. Now, I was giving them a reason to speak up. This was bigger than me now. It was about every person she'd bullied. I was determined to show them they didn't have to live under her thumb anymore. I set up a meeting with Carl, the same neighbor who'd stopped her from shooting. I needed someone who understood the law and would stand beside me in this fight. Carl had been a cop for over 2 decades, and while chasing down HOA bullies wasn't exactly in his job description, he knew how to handle messy situations like this. He also knew Debbie. He'd dealt with her before, and let's just say he wasn't exactly impressed by her theatrics. One afternoon, we sat in my living room going over everything I had collected. Carl combed through the HOA's bylaws, and we both cracked up at how absurd most of them were. Rules about grass height, what kind of flowers you could plant, even the dimensions of your trash cans. It was obvious the HOA wasn't about community, it was about control. And Debbie had crowned herself queen. But as Carl pointed out, she had some blind spots, and those were my ticket to bringing her down. I've been thinking, Carl said, setting the paperwork aside. You've got a strong case. You've got evidence and witnesses ready to testify about her harassment. But here's what you're missing: public exposure. I raised an eyebrow. Public exposure? He nodded. Yeah, you've got to make this public. Social media, neighborhood chatter, whatever works. People need to see who Debbie really is. You're not just going after her. You're challenging the whole HOA power structure. And trust me, plenty of folks would love to see her fall. I like the sound of that. I've always believed in handling things myself, but Carl's idea had a certain appeal. We could flip Debbie's own game on her, use her tactics, and make sure she didn't just become another suburban Karen nightmare. We'd turn her into a warning story. That night, I crafted a post for the neighborhood Facebook group. I didn't name her outright, didn't have to. I just laid out everything that had been happening. The endless fines, the petty complaints, how Debbie had used the HOA to make everyone's lives miserable. I also included the rifle incident, to make it clear I wasn't the only one she'd gone after. I kept the tone factual, but anyone reading it knew this was a bombshell. I hit post and waited. The reactions came fast. People were stunned. Some were outraged about what happened to Maximus. Others were just relieved someone was finally standing up to Debbie. What shocked me most was how many neighbors had their own stories. Seemed like everyone had been steamrolled by the HOA at some point. And now, finally, They were ready to speak up. By the end of the night, the post had exploded across the neighborhood. People were commenting, tagging each other, sharing their own run-ins with Debbie's nonsense. Messages poured in from folks offering to back me up, willing to testify about what they'd experienced. Debbie's hold on the community was cracking. The next morning, she called me. She was livid. She'd seen the post and wasn't happy. She tried to guilt-trip me, said I was destroying her name, making her out to be the villain. But I didn't feel bad. I told her straight up, she did this to herself, and she couldn't keep hiding behind the HOA. She threatened to call the cops on me, but I wasn't even a little scared. I'd already done my research. I knew exactly which laws she'd broken, and I was ready to take her to court if it came to that. But it wasn't just the legal fight I was preparing for, it was the social one too. Debbie made a huge mistake messing with Maximus, and now, thanks to social media, everybody knew. The momentum had shifted. The power was changing hands, and I wasn't about to let it slip. That afternoon, Carl and I met again. We mapped it all out, what Debbie's next moves might be, how to counter the fallout, and how to make sure she couldn't wriggle out of this one. I had no plans to let her walk. This time, she was going to answer for what she'd done. But as Carl and I planned our next steps, something else started to settle in. This wasn't just about Maximus anymore. It was about every single person Debbie had pushed around. If she thought she could win this, she was in for a surprise. Debbie had no clue what was coming. She thought she could intimidate me, keep control of the HOA, and skate by untouched. But I wasn't backing down. The fight was just getting started. And by the time it was over, she'd wish she never pointed that rifle at my bull. Things escalated fast after the post went up. What started as a single act of defiance turned into an unstoppable wave. Comments poured in, and by the end of that first day, the post had gone full-blown viral in the neighborhood. Story after story popped up, most of them about Debbie, and all about how she'd made life harder for everyone around her. It didn't take long before the local news caught wind of the story. I hadn't intended for any of this to blow up, but watching Debbie finally get a taste of her own medicine felt pretty satisfying. Her grip on the neighborhood was cracking, and I was enjoying every second. Debbie didn't take it well. The very next day, she showed up at my front door, livid. Her face was flushed, hands trembling with fury, and she didn't come alone. She'd dragged the entire HOA. Bored with her, lined up behind her like backup on a power trip. They claimed they were there to discuss the matter, but we all knew the truth. They were there to strong-arm me into taking down my post and backpedaling. They figured they could pressure me like they had so many others. But not this time. I wasn't giving in. I saw it in Debbie's eyes. She was rattled. She hadn't seen this coming, and now she was reeling. I'd built a strong foundation, not just legally, but socially. The neighborhood was done with her, and she knew it. Folks who had been silent for years were speaking up, finally pushing back. I stood there with my arms folded, letting her rant. "You have no idea what you've done," Debbie shouted. "You've ruined everything. I'm going to make sure you regret this. You and your bull. You think you're untouchable." I let her go off for a bit. I wasn't interested in her yelling or her threats. Just noise now. "Debbie," I said, cutting in. "You've made plenty of enemies around here. You've spent years bullying people, and now they're standing up to you. I'm just the beginning." She paused, suddenly unsure. "What do you mean by that?" She snapped, voice quieter but still venomous. I replied, stepping closer. "You've built your life around controlling people, using the HOA to harass, to fine, to intimidate. But that's over. The folks you've pushed around, they're done staying quiet. And you can't hide behind your board anymore. You're finished." Her face contorted with rage, but there was fear behind it now too. She was realizing just how far she'd gone, and how much pushback was waiting. The more she raged, the more her own board started backing away. I could see them exchanging nervous glances, questioning if they'd hitched themselves to the wrong leader. Debbie was no longer their pride and joy. Momentum was shifting. She made one last desperate move. "I'm calling the police," she barked. "Posting all of this is illegal. I'll have you charged with defamation." I could see the panic in her eyes, scrambling for a way out, but I wasn't even a little worried. The facts were on my side. "Go ahead," I said with a grin. "But maybe check your own legal exposure first. Shooting someone's livestock has consequences. And those HOA fines you've been handing out? Not as legit as you think. You've been pushing boundaries for too long." Debbie's jaw clenched tight as the weight of it hit her. She'd been reckless, and it was finally catching up. I wasn't scared of her, not anymore. I'd already spoken to an attorney, and I had all the proof I needed to make sure she didn't get away with it. And now that the post had gone viral, the whole neighborhood knew exactly who she was. Her shield of authority was gone. I watched as frustration twisted across her face. She looked like she wanted to scream, to lash out, to find something. Anything, to claw back control. But nothing came. The people she'd tormented were through with her. Her loyal base? Gone. All she had left was anger. She turned abruptly, storming off, her board trailing behind in a broken formation. They looked lost, unsure, finally waking up to how badly they'd misjudged everything. It wasn't just me anymore. It was everyone she'd burned. They'd seen the support my post got, and they knew this wasn't going away. As they disappeared down the street, I felt a surge of relief. I'd done it. I'd taken down the self-appointed queen of the HOA, and it felt damn good. But I also knew this wasn't the finish line. Debbie wasn't going to go quietly. She'd scheme, try to manipulate, try to twist things back in her favor, but I was ready. The war wasn't over. But I'd just scored one hell of a victory. The next few days were a whirlwind. I spent my days locking down the legal details, making sure every piece was in place to stop Debbie from pulling any stunts. I never figured she'd just back off without a fight. She was stubborn, and I knew she'd try something. But I was ready for her. Meanwhile, the whole neighborhood kept backing me up. Folks who used to stay quiet finally started speaking out. The HOA board, realizing their star player wasn't untouchable anymore, began to step away from Debbie. They saw how things were shifting and weren't about to risk their own seats over her. The knockout came when the HOA, after going over everything, issued a formal apology to me. They wiped out every fine and restriction they'd slapped on my property, admitting they had crossed the line. It was one of those generic, lawyer-approved apologies that didn't say much, but still, it counted. It was a win, maybe small, but it mattered. As for Debbie, she tried to push back, but the neighborhood wasn't with her anymore. The backlash was so strong, she ended up packing her bags and leaving. The going-away party she got wasn't exactly what she'd imagined. Nobody stood by her. She torched every relationship she had, and she left empty-handed. I watched her drive off, and a wave of satisfaction came over me. Maximus, my faithful bull, strolled by and gave me a look like he approved. This time I'd won.